Good evening, everybody. I'm Jacques Silbert, a former president of ECINEQ, and that's why I've been asked to introduce Marc Fleurbaey's lecture. I'm very honored to be the one who will present Marc Fleurbaey. Let me just say a few words about Marc. Marc is one of those rare economists who has an excellent background in mathematics, in economics, obviously, and in philosophy. He acquired, I guess, his background in mathematics because he prepared what's called in France the Grandes Écoles, which means that after school, the 13th and 14th grade, he intensively studied mathematics. This is a period where those preparing those Grandes Écoles are working like crazy, and they learn, I don't know, between 10 and 20 hours of mathematics a week. And then he studied at the ENSAE, École Nationale, the National School of Statistics and Economic Administration, which is a school where those who have position of responsibility at the National Institute of Statistics in France, they all studied there before they had this position. In addition, so obviously, during the 3 years or 2 or 3 years of this school, he acquired a lot of economics, of econometrics, but also working, I guess, with database and so on. So this is about the background in mathematics and economics, but in addition, Marc has a master in philosophy. So this explains, how wide his horizon and his background is. Now, Marc worked for about 6 years at INSEE, the National Institute of Statistics, and then he shifted to teaching. He first taught at various universities in France, and then for the past 4 or 5 years, he moved to, about 4 or 5 years ago, he moved to Princeton. Marc has published, I won't sit down, 15 books, and more than 100 articles, and needless to say, in excellent journals. The topics of his research cover happiness, equality of opportunity, social justice, etc. And I had the pleasure of attending one of his keynote lectures 3 years ago at the meeting of the International Association of Research in Income and Wealth. And so I can guarantee you that you're going to have a very interesting and original lecture. Marc, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Jacques, and thank you, the organizers, for having me here. I really enjoy this conference very much. So what I want to do here is actually very different from the previous lectures. I want to share some new ideas and see how you react. So it's really, I'll be talking more about a research program. I will not present results. I will neither theorems. I will really want to share. I want to share some ideas about the direction of research that I think should be tried, and I'd be very happy to get your feedback here or later, anytime. So the motivation for what I'm doing here is the idea that social interactions are not represented well enough in many of our studies. I've been working myself on economic models with the issue of resource allocation. So these models are more concrete than the pure social choice model, which is completely abstract, where you don't know what the structure of the alternatives are. But even the models in which you study fairness are models in which things are very poor. You have a few dimensions which are commodities. Sometimes you have labor, and that's about it. And you don't describe many things that are important to people, and especially you don't describe social interactions in an interesting way. And so I think it would be nice to do more in this direction. And in order to go in that direction, I think we should go further in the direction of being more concrete, going away from abstraction, putting more structure in our models. So that's the idea. There is a paper that's associated with this lecture. I can send it to you if you want. It's a paper that focuses on the last point of this slide, which is that it's interesting to take inspiration from theories of justice. And theories of justice have an interesting divide at the moment. There is a sort of quarrel between those who view justice as a matter of distribution and those who view justice as a matter of relations. What I'm trying to do in that particular paper is to say that we can actually reconcile them and propose a sort of vision of society, a sort of model in which the two aspects, distribution and relations, are jointly important instead of competing. They are somehow complementary in a complete representation of what's going on. So that's the motivation. I'm not the first one to be interested in putting more about social interactions in our analysis. In 1974, Gary Baker published a paper modestly entitled The Theory of Social Interactions. And so you have a lot of work, including in economics. So let me briefly mention the kind of directions that you can observe in various parts of the literature. So in economics, people have been interested in particular in the departures from Homo economicus, right? So from the pure consumer kind of attitude. And doing that, they have identified interesting policy levers, which have to do with social multipliers. When you change things in a group of the population, that can influence other groups, and then you get additional effects. And also, you can change people's situation just by moving them around, changing the groups to which they belong or with which they interact. So, in terms of, this is not exhaustive at all. This is just a description of a few branches of the literature. You have, of course, the very well-known work by Akerlof and Cranton on identity and inclusion, which has to do with the fact that it matters to people to belong to certain groups or to have a certain identity, and they will defend it, including against intruders, right? So that's something that can produce behaviors which are extremely hard to explain for standard economic behavior. And you have mathematical models of social interactions which go in two directions. So some models have to do more with the influence that people receive from others that push them in certain directions. And especially Stephen Derloff and co-authors have developed an important branch of the literature. And there are very interesting papers. Mansky has explained that the analysis of such interactions involves different channels of causality. So there are things that are influenced by the behavior of the others with which you interact, with whom you interact, things that are influenced by the characteristics of the others. So this is not endogenous, this is more the context in which you are. And there are pure correlations that just come from the fact that people have similar characteristics and happen to be in the same circumstances. So you have a lot of interesting concepts that are there. And there is a second branch, which is also somewhat mathematical in some of the works, which has to do with positional goods, so status seeking, the fact that people may compare themselves to others and try to somehow to outcompete the others in terms of status. There is one feature of these models which will not be very useful for me, given what I'm trying to do, which is that they focus really on a kind of universe in which you have one dimension. People will compare what they have in this dimension to others, and they will move their action on this dimension, being influenced by interactions with others, but essentially everything happens on the real line. And so it can be income, right? So if you are interested in status seeking in income and so on, that can be good. But I'm not sure it's enough if we want to have a rich description of social interactions in the context of analysis of inequalities and well-being, where you have multiple dimensions intrinsically. And so that's, I think, a key limitation of these types of works. There are other disciplines which, of course, are somehow more naturally specialized in social interactions than economics. Social psychology, which tries to do many things, but in particular to explain what's specific about group behavior. So my Princeton colleague, Susan Fiske, has a very important textbook in which she does many things, but in particular she identifies the aims, how people's aims change when they are in the group context. And so she does strange, weird things when she's teaching in an auditorium like that with her students. So she makes them do things they would never do if they were alone. And that illustrates the fact that when you are in a group, you behave in a specific way. And so she in particular has a theory, or at least a taxonomy, of the aims that people have when they are in the group context. And these aims include seeking control, status, understanding what's going on, trust in the interaction with others, and self-esteem. Okay? Sociology, of course, is also a discipline which is very much about social interaction, social relations. When you read or you interact with sociologists, very often they bring about the notions of power that are less prominent in economics. So power relations are quite important in their analysis, even though some prominent sociologists like Coleman and Bourdieu have actually, I think, borrowed from economists, and they try to analyze everything in terms of assets or capital, as Bourdieu would say. And there is the notion of social capital, which is also something that has been important in branches of sociology, even though I've read I think it's in Mansky's paper, that Glenn Lurie perhaps should be, who is an economist, should be credited for having used this term at some point, perhaps the first. Okay, so this is a sort of background on the literature. I must confess that my main inspiration for what I'm going to say is reading the work of many colleagues with whom we've been preparing a report, a sort of assessment report, a bit like the IPCC, but it's not on climate change, it's on social change. And it's a report on the perspectives of social progress in the coming decades. It's a group of 260 authors, so we are trying to mimic the IPCC. And quite a few colleagues in this room are actually part of this big group. And it's a fascinating text that we are producing. I'm learning a lot from that, and so that is inspiring me here. But of course, they shouldn't be held responsible for what I'm going to say. This is just my own interpretation of things that could be inspired by this work. So what will I do here? I'd like to first explain where I'm coming from in this domain of social interaction. So what would be a kind of standard approach to the analysis if I look at what I've done so far? But I will look a bit at economics, but also at philosophy, the philosophy of justice. Then I will introduce the approach I'd like to develop, and then give some hints about how that could potentially lead us to change a little bit our analysis of inequalities and cast the analysis of policy in a different light, perhaps. Okay, so that's the plan. So let me start with where I'm coming from. So I think we are very much influenced in the analysis of inequalities, all of us, by what I would call the budget paradigm. So the idea that inequalities are very important when they are in resources is something that is quite pregnant in economics, and for good reason people tend to focus on income, because income is something that is not just a quantity, it's also something that represents opportunities. So you have the budget set that can be interpreted as the opportunity set for consumption. And when you have a higher income, if you face the same prices, that means you have more opportunities, undoubtedly, okay, unambiguously. So whether you believe in terms of resources as the key variable for inequalities or for social justice, or you believe in opportunities, you should be interested in this kind of approach. Now, of course, when people face different prices, as occurs in different countries in particular, that complicates things. But even within a country, people face different prices on the labor market when they face different wage rates. And so you can have situations in theory where the budget sets cross. And so here, if you have the space of effort and disposable income, you could have a situation where you have someone who is not highly paid on the market but receives basic income support, and another person who is paid much more but is taxed more heavily. We could have a crossing. What do we do in that case? Well, the comparison is no longer as simple as it was in the case of consumption goods with the same prices. But of course, you could say, well, that is unlikely to happen because the typical redistribution policy is something like an income tax. So you don't observe people's abilities or their wage rates on the market. And so typically what you have in the second best context is that the budget sets of people are nested, and those who have greater productivity, greater wages, have budget sets which include, which are bigger and ambiguously than the budget sets of those with less abilities. And so that's something that is true, but that doesn't make the analysis much simpler, because in particular, if you want to find out what would be optimal, you will need to analyze the shape of these budget curves that depend on the tax schedule, and that then you need to be able to compare the value to people in terms of well-being of these different things. So again, it's not simple. So what has been not so popular in economics in general, but I think is worth exploring, is the equivalence approach, which is somehow a natural fallback idea, which has been developed in economics under the label of monometric utility, in particular, starting with Samuelson, and which is the idea of coming back to the simple situation where you have budget sets which are all nested, nicely nested, and have the same slope. And so if you imagine, and you will not look at the actual budget sets of the people, but at these hypothetical budget sets that would give people the satisfaction that they have currently, right? So if we have two individuals and we look at their indifference curves, we don't look at their actual budget sets, but we can imagine what are the budget sets that would give them these levels of satisfaction for a certain reference slope, right? So here it would be a reference wage rate, a net wage rate, which would be fixed. And we can compare them in this setting. Okay, so that's something that brings us back, not in the real world, but in a hypothetical world that is Pareto equivalent to the world in which people live, because we are really following them on their indifference curves. So far, so good, but this is somehow not yet about social interaction. So let me now bring the topic of social interaction. So far, I've been looking at something like the labor market or the consumer market. If we bring social interactions into the picture, we could think of it as additional dimensions of quality of life. The quality of social relations, that could be a dimension of quality of life, just as your level of health and this sort of thing. And so we can easily extend the notion of equivalent income to incorporate these additional dimensions, which are non-market dimensions of life. Actually, Baker, in his 1974 paper, has this notion of social income, which includes the value of social interactions to the people. And this is essentially the notion that I'm talking about here. So the idea is that you will pick a reference value of quality of life. So this is an indifference curve for a person. It's not monotonic because it can be, if you think of interactions, for instance, interaction with your mother-in-law, there might be an optimal quantity, but it might not be infinite. So that's the kind of thing that can happen. And so you could have an indifference curve like that. And so you pick this reference value, and we don't know where the person is on this indifference curve. It doesn't matter. We look at the intersection of the indifference curve with this vertical line, and that gives us the equivalent income. So that's the level of income that would give the same satisfaction as the person has now if she was enjoying the mother-in-law at this reference level. Okay? Okay, so that's something that is a very kind of obvious possible extension and incorporation. You can even refine that a little bit, because one problem with, I haven't mentioned that before, but you have it already here. One problem with this approach is that you need to specify the reference world in which you transfer things, right? So what is the slope that you should be using here? And similarly, what is the level that you should be using here? So one possibility is to try to endogenize that. So let me briefly mention that you can do it, for instance, in this way, by saying we will, for every individual, we will pick the reference that corresponds to the situation that minimizes the equivalent income for this person, right? So you can end up with different references for different people, even different references for the same person at different levels of satisfaction. Okay, so that's one possibility, and it's not the only possibility. Okay, so I've been pushing, so we were talking about that with Martin yesterday. Martin says that he abandoned pushing this idea some decades ago because it was not very popular. I'm still trying to push, not much more successful now, but I think it's really an approach that is worth exploring. But there are other approaches. And so, as I said, one thing that bothers people with the equivalence approach is the choice of the reference. The other approaches also have their difficulties, but they are sometimes as popular or even more popular. There is the objective approach, especially the one that is inspired by the capabilities approach of Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, which consists in not trying to respect people's preferences, but choosing weights, and the weights can be the object of a community discussion. And so the problem of choosing the weights of the various dimensions is a thorny issue for this approach. But the idea is that it should be a sort of collective choice. And you have the subjective approach, which is based on subjective well-being surveys, and which some people like Richard Layard think produce data that you can use as representing people's satisfaction. And their satisfaction can depend, and the data seem to show that satisfaction depends on aspects which are really social. Your family situation, your occupational status, and things like that seem to play a role. So that indeed not only suggests that it can incorporate social relations, but actually shows that they matter to people. A difficulty, if we want to use that for inequalities, is that we need to be able to compare across people. And so there are issues of whether people's answers to such surveys are trustworthy, because people might use different reference scales, especially if they come from different cultures or different social groups. And also over time, as people go along in their life, they may change their perspectives about what's good and what's not so good. And so that's the issue for this approach. Can we compare the answers? So I was thinking perhaps we could try to think of something like a three-horn dilemma or trilemma between these problems, right? So we have three problems. The comparability problem, so we'd like to avoid the comparability problem. We would like to avoid the arbitrariness in weighting, and we would like to avoid, so what is that? One issue with I've said that one issue with the equivalent income is the choice of reference. But deeper than that, behind the choice of reference, what is problematic is that depending on where the reference is, you will tend to favor certain types of preferences. And the way it works is that if you want to put that in analysis of inequality, or in a social welfare function that is inequality averse, you will put the focus on the worse off people. So who is worse off depending on the choice of reference that you take? So if you take a very high value for the quality of life, you will consider that the worse off are the people who have very strong preference for this quality of life when they are in this area. And conversely, if you look at, if you take a low reference value, you will consider the worse off people are the people who have a very low preference for this quantity. Okay? So there is an issue here that you cannot really be neutral if you choose the reference. That will somehow put the focus on certain types of preferences in the population. And so you have this issue of not being neutral with respect to preferences when you go for the equivalence approach. And you see, if you take the subjective well-being approach, for instance, this is an approach that seems to be neutral, doesn't have a weighting problem because the weights are spontaneously chosen by the people, but it doesn't avoid the comparability problem. Okay? The objective approach can be neutral in a trivial way. It just ignores preferences, right? So it's neutral, but perhaps not in the best way. And it can compare people because by construction, the data that are aggregated are comparable across people. But it doesn't solve the weighting problem. And the equivalence approach has this difficulty of being not naturally neutral. Okay, so this is perhaps food for thought. Imagination, welcome here to how to try to combine to avoid these three problems. Okay, now what I'd like to do now is to say that all of this is good, but perhaps not good enough. The implicit model that is behind these approaches is what I would call perhaps the bucket list, or I shouldn't even say the laundry list approach to life, which is essentially looking at a space in which you have many dimensions, and you try to aggregate these dimensions, and that's it. So that's not so different from the consumer model, right? So it's essentially an extension of the budget approach, but not much more than that. And so my worry here is that it's probably something that is still too abstract, and especially it's probably a mistake to treat social relations or the quality of social relations something like a good. It's not neither a private nor a public good nor a club good. It's something that should probably be treated in a different way. So that's my worry. And especially we should be able to distinguish different sorts of interactions that play different roles in people's life. And so all I'm trying to say is that we should be more concrete. We should not just say, oh, there is a list of dimensions, and then you work in this space of dimensions. People navigate in this space, and you just have to evaluate how to aggregate the thing. No, probably that's not enough, and that's what I'm trying to, I will try to convince you of that in this talk. Okay, now let me, before I go to my proposal, let me say a word about social justice. So this debate in social justice about the distributional approach and the relational approach is not uninteresting, but it doesn't seem to go anywhere. So you have the idea that if you want to have a good distributional approach, it should be comprehensive. And so it could be either in terms of resources for some philosophers like Rawls, Dworkin, or opportunities for other philosophers. But in both cases, somehow the budget paradigm is still there, right? Lurking behind the scene. The relational approach is less popular in philosophy, and you have prominent philosophers like Liz Anderson and Samuel Scheffler, but it's not very precise, so it remains a bit vague, and so it's a lot about dignity and power, but it's hard to really pin down a very concrete description. So, of course, in this quarrel between the two approaches, the distributional people have said, well, we can accommodate social relations, just essentially in the way I've discussed before in the previous slides, right? And John Rawls himself had a list of what he called social primary goods, and in this list you have two items which were about social relations. You had the social basis of self-respect, and you had the prerogatives and responsibilities of positions of authority, again, something that has very much to do with social interaction. But again, what I'm worried about is that relational goods are probably not ordinary goods. So they are not produced and distributed like ordinary goods. So we should be more concrete. And I have the impression that in these theories of justice, things remain too abstract, and in both schools, actually. So that when people, it's not that they remain in abstraction, actually. Many philosophers make proposals for institutions and reforms, how society could become more just. But their proposals, there is a leap between the theories, which are quite abstract, and the proposals, and this leap is perhaps a place where economists and other social sciences can help. All right, so let me now dive in the pool and describe what I'm thinking about. So it's quite different from the positive theories of interaction, because I'm interested not so much in how things really work in the causal mechanisms. I'm interested in how things go for people, whether it's good or bad for them, because this is about inequalities ultimately, or about defining social justice, right? And so the focus, the center of the story is the individual. And the individual is in interaction not with other individuals, although that can happen, of course, but the context of the interaction is always with certain spheres, okay? So there are spheres of different shapes, which correspond to different things. So you have a list of possible spheres you can think about here, right? The household, friends and relatives, and so on. you have the state, you have NGOs, associations, you have the workplace, the school, the labor market, and all the markets, and so on. So all these things are what I call sphere, and the key idea here is that the social interactions I'm interested in are not primarily the inter-individual interactions, but really the interaction between the individual whose situation we try to evaluate and organizations, groups, okay, which I call spheres. And the interaction takes place in the following way. So the individual meets a particular sphere by bringing assets to the sphere, right? So I'm still an economist in a way, okay? So I still think in terms of assets. So the individual brings assets, which are things that can help the individual having success. Then the sphere has some rules of the game. Some things happen in the sphere, which can be a sort of game situation or something like that. And the individual comes back from the interaction with certain outcomes, okay? And the assets and the outcomes, I think, can be analyzed more or less in the same space, right? So when you interact with the sphere, some of your assets may be depleted, but you may actually increase some of them. And the assets you get from one sphere, you can use in another sphere, right? And so if you think, for instance, of the income you get in your work, you can use in your circle of friends, or you can use in your family, and so on and so forth, right? So the reputation that you obtain in one sphere can help you in another sphere. So if you have a reputation of a good person in the neighborhood, that can help you finding a job and this sort of thing. My little model here looks like a static thing, but in fact what happens is that people have repeated interactions and they build up their assets throughout their lives, right? So they build up things through these repeated interactions with various spheres. And the fact that you have things going on with multiple spheres repeatedly and sequentially means that what happens in one sphere will influence how things go for the individual in another sphere. So if you think in terms of policy, and I'll come back to that, if you think that you intervene in one sphere, that will change things in potentially many other spheres, right? So these interactions are quite important. Of course, spheres can also directly try to influence one another, right? So you have lobbying, regulation, many things can happen from one sphere to another. Okay, that's a little drawing, not really a model. So the model that would accompany that would be something like that. So this is just for purpose of illustration, but let me try to explain what I have in mind. So you have the individual that would somehow try to build up something that is optimal in terms of certain goals, right? So you have a utility function. This is the path. So AI is the vector of assets and assets outcomes, right? So it's the same thing. And that's over the period that we consider from, let's say, from birth to death. So we have a horizon. At time t, the individual has to take into account the past, so the past cannot be changed. So that's a constraint, but that's a constraint that may influence how he envisions the future. So preferences need not be separable over time. And what happens is that the individual will interact with spheres. So that's what happens in spheres. But what the individual has to do is the asset that the individual has at a particular time tau can be distributed over the various spheres. So you can invest more of your wealth in certain things than in others, more of your time in certain things than others, and so on, right? So this investment has to be divided. It's not a simple aggregation. There are things that are not aggregative. Your knowledge, you can use it in various ways without really having to divide it in slices. So you have a budget constraint here, so to speak, which defines how you can split your investment in various spheres, the assets you bring to spheres in various ways, depending on what you have now, right? So that's the thing. So this is a vector of things that you will distribute in various spheres. So the spheres are J here. And once you bring that to a sphere, what happens to you? Well, there is this interaction in the sphere, and you have a reduced model here that depends on your characteristics. And your characteristics can be your gender, your race, your age, and things like that. actually not age, it would be the date of birth in this model. And the thing here is actually you still have some leeway. So you have two margins of maneuver here. You can choose how to invest in various spheres. And once you have brought an investment in the spheres, you may still have, the sphere will give you an opportunity set. And this is OJ. And you would be able to choose from that, right? And so I'm adding up these opportunity sets because they are all in the same space, so to speak. And so what I can choose combines the opportunities offered by different spheres, right? So I can get income from various spheres. I can ask money from my friends. I can work and get money from my employer and so on. And that will give me the total money I have at the end and so on. And I can do that for the various dimensions of the assets, which include, as you'll see, not just money, but many other things. And so what happens is that these opportunities will change. So that's the change of my assets at period tau. Okay? So that's the kind of model we could imagine working with. It's a bit too general, and I will immediately move to looking for something a bit simpler. But before I do that, let me briefly compare with the models of social interactions that you have, especially in economics, which are quite different from this kind of thing. So the first thing is that the interactions in the spheres are just a sort of reduced model here, just a sort of opportunity set, so it's a kind of reduced form. The economics of social interactions essentially is about something completely different in a way, because it's about influences across people, whereas here my model is essentially individualistic, right? So the individual is just caring about building up the assets of a life. And so that's not quite what you find in social interaction models, where you have people being influenced by others, right, in a more direct way. So you could imagine, you could enlarge the model and say that the individual actually has preferences which depend on the actions of the others. That would be much more like what you find in the economics of social interaction. So that's possible. That's an addition to the model. So what I'm trying to convey here is that this addition to the model is good, it's welcome, and it's probably accurate because these phenomena exist. But even without that, we can capture a lot by this story about the interaction with organizations, groups, and so on, right? So it might be even that the most important aspects in the analysis of inequalities have not so much to do with conformism and status seeking in this sense of being influenced by what the others do directly, but by these interactions with various spheres. Okay, so that's one of the messages. One thing that is a bit frustrating in these models is that you have this real line thing with a variable that you choose, and you compare what you do with what the others do. So they don't have this dimension of somehow you invest and then you get a return on your investment when you interact with a sphere. So I think that's something that is perhaps more explicit in this model. And the last, perhaps the most important thing is that I think really we need to be, as I said, more concrete, and that means that we need to recognize the existence of different spheres and the interaction with these spheres that create spillovers and that create trade-offs. So people have to manage things between different spheres, and that may be somewhat tricky in some cases, as I will describe. So the simplification I'd like to go over now is to try to give something that is a bit more concrete, because my general model was still very abstract, and so it's nice to talk about being concrete, but if you don't show an example, it's hard to believe you. So let me suggest that we could perhaps already say interesting things if we focused on just a few spheres and a few asset outcomes. So the spheres could be the family, the state, the workplace, and I'm a bit hesitant about merging it with the labor market. I think these are two different things. The workplace is really a non-market institution in a way, but sometimes it might be okay to simplify a bit here, and the other markets, right? So that would be a reduced, simpler model. And in terms of asset outcomes, I'll take inspiration a little bit from the list I gave in one of the first slides. And of course, there will be resources. This is important. control and status will be retained from the list in social psychology. So control is not controlling others. Control is essentially controlling your situation. That can involve having power over others, right? But it's not the main thing. It's essentially control over your own situation. And status is a rather large notion, or perhaps we should call it standing. It's really how you stand in the various groups, how you are considered, and how you have access to different interactions, right? Knowledge is just a general word for things having to do with education, but also information about what's going on in organizations. So it's strategic information about various things is quite essential. We had a very nice lecture before talking about whistleblowers. So this is the kind of thing that can indeed be absolutely essential and change-making. And health, I think health is hard to forget. It's something that can also constrain or empower people very much. So let me try to suggest, in order to be more concrete, to give you examples of what I have in mind. Control and status are the two notions that I'd like to hammer in this talk. And things can go wrong in these two dimensions in different ways. So let me give examples. So things can be problematic for the control dimension in at least three ways. One is being subordinated, right? So you are under the orders of someone else. That's when you have low control because of these orders. Another is dependent. So you can be dependent without being subordinated. You are dependent, for instance, when you are a welfare recipient who is not sure that the allowance will be renewed. That depends on the goodwill of the social worker, or it depends on the capricious politics of the country or of the city, and so on. So even if you think, for instance, of women not being able to walk around at night, that's something that depends on external things. So it's not a matter of orders, it just depends on the conditions that are external. And obligations is something that can also constrain you. You can be obligated because people accept you to do certain things. For instance, in certain social milieus, I knew if you were the last sibling in a family, you were expected to take care of your parents much more than the others, especially if you were the last girl in the family. In some cases, you were not, even you were expected not to marry in order to be able to remain available. So there are things like that which can constrain you. It's not a matter of orders, it's not directly dependence, it's just expectations that bear on you and somehow constrain your. Another good example is in developing countries where many people struggle. If you happen to have access to a good job or to a source of revenue, you have a strong obligation with respect to the rest of your extended family, and that can essentially force you to do things you wouldn't do otherwise, like, for instance, getting into corruption schemes. In terms of status, things can go wrong in various ways. So you can be excluded, so that's quite simple, okay, ostracism. You can be subject of contempt, okay? People can essentially humiliate you and or not consider you well. Or you could be discriminated, which is you are not excluded, you are part of the scheme. You are not exactly treated with contempt, but you are given a role that is very special, right? That is, you are put in a box, and that's also something that is not very good. Okay, so as I said, I'd like to convince you that these two things are important and should be put more in our analysis. And one way I can think of trying to convince you, some of you may have seen that already. I'm always using these kind of quotes. I've been very much influenced by this NGO, ATD Fourth World, which was created in France, and which has a very strong focus on dignity so it works with the very poorest people all over the world. And its motto is really to empower these people, to really make them the drivers of their liberation. And so you have quotes that come from them which are quite nice in the sense that they really show that even the poorest people, who should be perhaps those who should focus the most on material needs, are actually talking about something else, right? They are talking about issues having to do with status and freedom and control. Okay, now Let me say just a word about, I don't have a very nice, elegant model of what's going on in certain spheres. It's pretty easy on the markets. The budget model works well for the markets. The relation with the state also is relatively easy if we focus just on taxes. It's more complex if we think of politics, but I will not go into that here. What is more complicated is the workplace and the family. And here I'm thinking, for instance, if we focus on just two and a half dimensions. So if we put control and status together for a moment, because they somehow very often go together, and we have resources as another thing. So if you think of what you can find on the workplace, looking, for instance, on the job market, then what happens is that you have access to certain options that depend on your characteristics, and in particular your training, so your knowledge asset, but also other things like your social background and so on. And your gender and your race and so on, right? And so what happens is that you have something like an opportunity set, and this opportunity set is cut at different positions for different people, okay? So the disadvantaged people, we have a set that is somehow smaller than for other people. And the shape of this set can be quite complex. So typically, it's not like a budget set. It's something that actually, in many cases, seems to be perhaps almost like a curve, because the jobs that have that pay more are also those very often that have greater control and status, right? So if that's the case, then you have a curve. But sometimes it's more than that. Sometimes you have a choice. You can choose options which give you more control or more freedom, but pay a little less. So academics, for instance, perhaps are an example of this kind of thing. And so that's where you have some choice, right? And so the individual would choose in the interaction with the work sphere, would choose in a set that may be more or less large. Okay, so this is, you see, this is still very preliminary. The model should be developed more and so on. But let me try to continue with this simplified model and look at how it would tell us to revisit the analysis of inequalities. So, of course, the first thing you can think of is by looking at inequalities in the various domains, so the various assets or asset outcomes, as I call them. You could do that one by one, okay? And the trick here, I mean, the difficulty is that some of them are, we are accustomed to measuring them. So resources and health, for instance, there is a lot of literature on that. Knowledge, to some extent, we could say that we have things on education, of course, but not so much on the other aspects of information. Control and status, that's more tricky, and I'll say a word about that. So you can look at them, the inequalities one by one, but you can also look at bundles, and then we are back into the analysis of the aggregation of bundles that I was mentioning at the beginning. But we can do perhaps a bit more. So let me just have an aside on how to measure control and status. I don't have much to say about that. I just want to give examples of things that could work or could not work very well. So here is an example of a graph that is well known in the sociology of labor, which is called the Karasek-Theorel graph, which puts on the horizontal axis the demand that you have in your job. Okay, a job is demanding, and if you have, for instance, to reply quickly to a request or things like that, and you have the degree of autonomy that you have on the other axis, and these things are based on objects, kind of declarations of objective things, okay? So can you change the conditions of your work, or can you change the order in which you do your task and things like that? So it's more or less objective, but people have to choose on a scale the degree to which these things are satisfied. So it's, I would say, semi-objective or subjective. And then there is an aggregation of these various questions into an index of autonomy and an index of demand. So a lot of steps here. And this is an example of such a graph for the European workers between 1995 and 2010, which shows that we have increasing demand for many jobs, and we have decreasing autonomy for the least favored, the least advantaged jobs. And so in this kind of graph, you have this area here, which is the danger zone, where you have job strain or job stress. which is where people really have high demand and very little autonomy. That's an example of things that can be done. And you see, that's a bit discouraging in a way, because that shows this is all about control in a way. So having more demands reduces your control. So that's the obligation part, and that's the autonomy part. So that shows the complexity of these things. But hopefully, I think we can make progress. I've been wondering about whether we could use surveys which directly ask people about how much freedom they have in their life. And I'm a bit skeptical here, but I'd be happy to hear what you think. I'm not a specialist of these surveys. So for instance, the World Value Survey has such a question, which asks people direct ladder, Likert scale question from 0 to 10, how much freedom you have in your life. And so what you get is answers which are probably a bit too flat and not too different across people with, for instance, different levels of education. So the red curve here is people who have stopped at the high school. So the inequalities and the variations over time may be muted, because it's a bit like the subjective well-being surveys, where people tend to go into the middle or just above the middle, and therefore you don't see much in the analysis. So I'm a bit skeptical about the possibility to use broad subjective questions like that. We should probably be more objective in the way we measure things. So I will not say much more about measurement. For status, to me, it's even more a mystery. I think the multiple dimensions of status are hard to pin down in a simple way. So let me come back to the measurement of inequalities. So as I've said, we could still do the bundle thing or looking at inequalities dimension by dimension. But I think something else we could do is to look at the type of society we live in. And different societies propose, so you remember the set of options that I was describing here. So you can think of suppose it's reduced to a curve, or you can look at the scattered plot of people's situations in this space. Where are people? What is the shape of the scatter plot? And so we could imagine that the shape of the scatter plot could be of different types like that. So sorry for the typo here. This is a French spelling of Stalin. But so you have different societies. So for instance, this is perhaps Tocqueville's vision of America, where you have a lot of strong equality in status and a lot of independence for everyone, but strong inequalities in resources, right? The opposite being the USSR, where you have the inequalities are mostly in the other dimension and not so much in resources, even though there were many things that were hidden in terms of resources. And you have things where you have complex patterns where you have poor people who have very strong status differences, for instance, between races, and then you have inequalities, economic inequalities above a certain level. Or you can have economic inequalities between different professions up to the level where you reach the upper class, the upper caste of people who have, for instance, a certain literacy level. So the shape, looking at the shape of things could help us understand society's inequalities better. So I've been looking at this two-dimensional graph because it's simpler, but you can, of course, if have a five-dimensional graph, which I would not be able to do, but just splitting status and control would open new possibilities. So you could have things where people, for instance, if you think of comparing men and women, you could have a curve in the three-dimensional graph for men and a curve for women, which could be for same control and resources with a lower status or things like that. And you could look at how the curves, or it could be for races, how the curves differ, and they might meet at the top of the curve or they might meet at the bottom, and that would correspond to different patterns of discrimination. So there are many things that could be said with these scatter plots in a way. The other dimension of inequalities that could be looked at, and this is, I don't claim that this is really new, but is to look at the return on the contribution. So you have the interaction with the sphere, which goes by you contribute an asset and you get something in return. So we could have something that is an analysis of the return of certain investments by people in terms of various outcomes, depending on their characteristics, right? So if you are a woman or if you are a black person and so on, what kind of return do you have compared to other people? So things which are very popular, done very often is the resource return on schooling or work. Okay, so that's the most obvious that we know very well. But it would be interesting to look at other dimensions, right? And how people are rewarded in terms of status and control in particular in various spheres. And finally, the last type of analysis that we could do is trade-offs. So people may face trade-offs in outcomes. So it might be that when I was talking about the set that you are offered, for instance, at work or in the family. By the way, I didn't say that the situation in the family is a bit like the family like the situation in work, in the workplace. And so you have also a set that is offered to you. And there you can have trade-offs. So you might have to abandon certain ambitions on certain dimensions in order to get other things. And so the kind of trade-off I have in mind is when you have to accept tasks that you really don't like, that you find degrading, but you will accept them because that's the only way you can get the resources you want or this sort of thing. And so that's trade-offs in the outcomes that you can have. But there are also trade-offs between spheres. So you might have to sacrifice success in one sphere in order to be able to do what you want in another sphere. And so the example in particular I have in mind is this very well-known problem that it's very hard for women to succeed both in the work sphere and in the family sphere, whereas men seem to be able to succeed in both spheres. So why is that? Well, so that's the kind of opportunity set that they have if you look at the combination of the two spheres, right? So that's the idea. You combine two spheres and you look at what people can do in these two spheres. The thing that's represented here is the level of success, so to speak. So it's not just a sort of synthetic idea. And so what happens is that a simple explanation for this situation is just that the demands, so the rate of return for women in the family is not the same as for men, because women are supposed to provide a lot of time to the family, whereas men are supposed to provide not so much time, but resources, right? And so for men, it's a good deal because you focus on work, you give your time to your work, you get resources that you can provide to your family, and you get success on both fronts. Whereas for women, you need to split your time between the two spheres, and that's much harder to do. Okay, so that's the kind of analysis that would be. I mean, this is just a simple example, but okay. I'm not sure I have the time to really go through this kind of model. So that's just a version of my previous model, simplified in various ways with just a one-shot individual decision, and the individual again chooses between two things, so something like resources or wealth and status, and the choice that the individual makes has to do with playing with two spheres. So there is the work sphere where your earnings depend on the time you devote to this thing, and you have inheritance and you have taxes. So that's the interaction with the state. And the status dimension would depend on status you get at work and status you get in the family. And that's where, for instance, the gender divide would depend really. So the status at work depends on the time you devote there, and the status in the family might depend on the time you devote to the family. You have a constraint on your time, which may be dependent on your health. And this, what happens to you depends on your characteristics, right? So whether you are a man or a woman in the family will determine whether what's crucial to bring to the family is your time or your resources. So this kind of thing can be analyzed, I think, with such a simple model. And this model could be a sort of backbone for empirical analysis and estimating these various functions. The fact that you have a summation here is, I'm not sure it's a strong limitation. It's probably something that could be done. And so with this simple model, you could do what I've been explaining before, right? So you can do the various dimensions. So you can look at the inequalities in the various success dimensions, asset outcomes. You can look at the shape of these things in this space. You can look at the returns in the various spheres. So that's the wage function. That's the status function in the two spheres. So that defines your return. And you can look at the trade-offs. So the trade-offs are trade-offs between dimensions. So between W and S, for instance, you may have to sacrifice your status in order to get more income. and you have trade-offs between spheres, and that's in particular the thing that happens between these status here in the two spheres. Okay, so these are the various types of analysis that could be done with this approach. Now, let me say a few words before I close on how we could revisit policy with this approach. So if you look at this kind of model of interactions, policy can do various things. It can distribute assets, of course, so you have the initial distribution in terms of resources and schooling and so on, and you have redistribution, right? So that's the kind of classical thing. But the other thing that policy can do is to try to change the rules of the game in the interactions. And that's something that can have to do with governance. For instance, in the workplace, it's quite important to look at how things are done in terms of power relations, but also in terms of discrimination. And for instance, the welfare state interventions can really help people, but can also harm them in various ways, depending on how intrusive they are, on how shameful they can be for people. So changing the rules of the game is something that is perhaps easier to imagine for the workplace than for the family, but in fact, even the family is submitted to certain laws, and this afternoon we had Claudia ECINEQ giving us the law in Germany of the family, and in East Germany and West Germany, you had a very different wording for what should happen in the family, so that was in the law, and that had quite strong consequences. And so you can use this framework to think of the indirect effects, right? So as I said, the welfare state might hinder development of people in the family or in the neighborhood if it's done in a clumsy way. But you can also think of the indirect interaction. So one thing that people often say is that child care services or elderly care services can be very helpful for women and giving them better access to the labor market and to a better status in their family. So this is really an indirect intervention. You do something in one sphere with the aim of helping in other spheres. There is the issue of trade-off. Let me perhaps skip that. It's a rather complicated story, but the main goal of the government should be to avoid putting people in hard trade-offs. And the vicious and virtuous circles and multipliers are here. So the multipliers that you find in the economics of social interactions have to do with reinforcement between individuals. And here we have other multipliers which have to do with reinforcement between spheres, right? So that's something that is interesting. I wanted to close by referring to Tony Atkinson's 15 proposals for action and looking at how we can read them in this context. So most of you know them, and you can find them. It's in his book, of course, but it's also on the internet, on his website. And I think that a few of them can be really read as relevant to what I was trying to describe. So in particular, the idea that the direction of technological change should be somehow influenced by policy in a way that is good for the employability of workers and for the human dimension of service provision. So very much about the quality of social interactions between people and the state. The second proposal, quite high in the list, is power among stakeholders, right? Which different domains, competition policy, trade unions, and social and economic council. So that's clearly having to do with this story about control. Guaranteed public employment, why that? Why propose that? That's not just about income, that's about status and inclusion. So it's something that is very much in this philosophy. I was talking about child benefits, okay, so they are here. The idea of the participation income is not just about income, it's also about certain guarantees and helping people. So that's an argument that has been used a long time by the advocates of such a basic income, that it will help people also being protected from bad trade-offs in the labor sphere. And you have other things which are perhaps look more like the things in blue here, which look more like standard economic ideas. but actually can be read also in the light of the impact they would have on the quality of social interactions in other spheres. Okay, I wanted to perhaps even conclude on something even a bit more political, in the sense that we are now in a context that is a bit weird, a bit strange, because it is now admitted. There is a sort of admitted complacency that we are in a situation now where there is no longer any obvious social cause, that things are much more complex, and that social movements anyway have more or less disappeared. Of course, you still have a few social movements here and there, Occupy and so on, but you have the Trump voters and so on, but all of that is somehow not directly linked to a clear social cause. And that's bizarre because, in fact, if you look at the pace of history, in fact, the changes are not that big. And in particular, women, workers, and colored people are still suffering from traditions, millennial or centennial traditions of domination. So we are still, of course, there are things that have improved, but the key social problems are still there, and they are there not just in the markets, but also in these issues of what happens in spheres like the family and the firm, and having to do with control and status. So I would like to really encourage us in our work to think more in this direction. So of course, not ignore markets, not ignore income and wealth. That's very important, but also investigate more what happens in other dimensions and in what happens in certain spheres like families and firms. I've looked at the ECINEQ program for this year, and I found some papers. Of course, reading the titles, I may have made misallocations, but my interpretation is that there are a few papers which are about the family and the household. I found one which is about the firm, and perhaps a couple who are about things that are connected to power, especially political issues, and perhaps status. But in a way, given the large program, it would be nice if we could have more than just a few units like that. It would be nice to have a greater share of the program devoted to that. So let me close here. This is just a kind of summary of my talk, and I'd be happy to get your feedback, either now or later if you want to send me comments or references. There might be literature I don't know. I'd be very happy to get help in this project. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we have time for questions. I guess a microphone will...
Yeah. Over there.
Thank you so much for the talk. That was indeed thought-provoking for me personally, and how the way in which social scientists think about these issues. But I was wondering, when you actually mentioned the framework, which was utility maximization framework, and so I just wanted to step back and ask whether that is the most suitable framework which you want to use for social interactions. That's first. And second is, in this, while discussing the constraints, what is the role of structures and where will you fit them in the, because it's not just individuals interacting with institutions, but on a larger macro scale, these are some of the permanent structures, if you will, which are in play. So what are your thoughts on that? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So on the maximization issue, that's a very good question. My impression is that we can go quite some way by keeping the rational choice model. And of course, behavioral, I'm a great fan of behavioral economics. And so incorporating bounded rationality and all these issues is very nice and important. But nevertheless, it may not be the priority in this direction. So it might be that many things can be done by retaining some sort of rationality where people try to navigate the various interactions in a way that is the most conducive to promoting their interest. One thing that I didn't say is that it's a maximization that was really a bit too simplified here. I did mention the fact that we could imagine having influence of what the others do, but we can also imagine that people are purely altruistic, and so what they might want to do is not to seize the best opportunity, the best option they can have in order to serve the interest of other people, right? So that's something that, that could happen very well. And it would make a lot of sense. So yeah, so that's a very important point. The other thing is, it's not so clear to me what you meant by structures, but indeed I was trying, in this model, I was trying to somehow give more flesh to this idea of structures. And it may not be a kind of grand macro structure story. It's a more micro thing where you have people in their family and in their workplace, in their school and so on. But somehow my impression is, but perhaps you want to say more about what you have in mind.
So by structures, I was saying the two parts. Sorry, thank you. Two parts is one, the norms and values which are actually manifested through the institutions. You spoke about institutions like family or community or various groups. I was more talking about more of the norms which underlie those institutions. For example, in when you gave the examples of, let's say, discrimination or status or control ills, they are strongly influenced by the normative structure, which is manifested then through various practices and institutions, right? So for example, you gave the diagram where you were talking about the women and workplace. Now, that has some solid normative base, which actually sort of mandates women to fulfill a particular gender role. And therefore, the actual manifestation of that happens where the division of work and labor happens with women in the family and men at the job market.
Right, okay. Yeah, so I think I understand. That's a good point. But that can still, I guess, most of these, especially things that really have to do with norms and entrenched customs and so on, that pervades different spheres because of these general views. That can probably somehow be embedded in the model easily by some sort of redundancy or not harmony, but some sort of similarity between certain biases in the various spheres, which make a system.
Yes, here. Cynthia.
Hi, I'm Thesa Garner. I'm with the National Statistical Office. I love this model. I believe in social actions is extremely important. I did a lot of work in subjective measures of economic well-being and poverty early on. But to put this into a context where, policymakers can start making decisions, based on analysis. In the federal statistical systems, not just in the United States, but internationally, we are getting more and more pressure to cut. So yes. How are we going to, what suggestions do you have for collecting data to help us analyze and test these models that you're developing?
Yeah, it's not so much, data are essential. I don't want to say that, but if it's in a context where you have fiscal pressure, actually the model is helpful to say the government can change rules of the game, and that's not cheap in the sense that it has costs induced by what changes in the economy and so on. But it is very cheap for fiscal policy in a way, right? Because you can somehow regulate things or incentivize things that will change the fate of people without moving money around, right? So my impression is that the challenge for the welfare state now is actually, in the current context, to try to do things by finding new revenues, new sources of revenues, and the carbon tax and things like that can be one such thing. But also to do things without revenue, really playing with what happens in the spheres and trying to, for instance, the key thing of governance, right? So we know that a lot of rent-seeking activity in firms could be curbed if we had better transparency and governance. So the previous lecture was very much about transparency. And so just exposing things and making things more transparent, but also changing the governance rules, accountability rules, can change a lot of things in people's lives, including, I mean, very concrete things. The pay gap in firms which are more horizontal or more democratic is much lower than in the firms which have been captured by an oligarchy. So this kind of thing can change a lot, including in resources, without the state having to really move money around. So that would be my reaction to this challenge. Now, in terms of data, of course, this is very preliminary, and I have the impression a lot needs to be done to somehow mainstream the analysis of these additional dimensions so that they become as standard as income. So we've made an amazing investment in the measurement of wealth and income. It's great, but now it's time perhaps also to expand to the other dimensions, which are, as I was trying to convey, perhaps as important, if not more important for many people.
The question? Can I ask a question? You mentioned in a list of control ills, obligation. Can you elaborate a little bit about obligation? Does it include moral obligation?
Yeah.
Why do you why do you call this control ill?
Right. So things so when you feel that you are expected to do certain things, and that somehow constrains your freedom, your decisions, that's when you have a potential problem, right? And so I gave the examples of, for instance, in developing countries when you know that if you have access, I've seen that myself when I was in Africa, the colleagues who suddenly had access to a certain source of income were under tremendous pressure from their extended family. And they had to, so that was an obligation, right? There was no order, it was just, it did not depend on these people. These people depended on them, but were imposing a sort of moral obligation. And so the gender roles, that's very much what a woman is expected to do in the family and so on, to take care of the kids. So this kind of thing, it's not so much, nobody says you should do that, but it's such a pressure. There are many pressures like that which are diffuse, but quite strong.
Any other question?
Before you let me go, I don't mean to stop you. I need to make one last logistical. Is there one more question? I didn't mean to.
Before we...
There is one over there, perhaps, yeah.
Yeah, one question there.
Yes, so following up a bit on the question just made, isn't that then this negative view of dependence, which this codependency can be actually a...
Sorry, I can't hear you well. Can you speak more slowly?
Okay, yes. Yes, couldn't be this negative view of dependence, this seeing control as a positive thing and dependence as this negative counterfactor, somewhat culturally limiting the model? Because, I don't know, this establishing commitments to other people and fulfilling them is an important element of why social relations could be a positive element.
Yeah, thanks. That's yeah. I often get this. I mean, not so often because I'm starting to present that, but yeah, that's an important question. So there is a potential trade-off between control and status, right? So status that includes inclusion, right? Being part of a group. And so, of course, when you are part of a group, that increases your obligations, that increases your dependence on other people's behavior, and so on. And so, so there is a trade-off. There is a very natural trade-off between these two things. And so it may be a matter of cultural preferences, that some people may invest more in status than in control. And so it might depend on that, right? So we might want to respect differences in cultures, even if they are really just inherited by people. That might be okay to some extent.
Okay, I was told we have to stop now, so let's thanks again, Marc.
Thank you very much. Okay.